Good evening and welcome to everyone who is joining us tonight. My name is Philip Steenkamp and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University. And thank you for being with us for another virtual edition of our Changemakers Speakers Series. Tonight, I'm delighted to say our guest is Lucy Suchman, who is here to talk about artificial intelligence. Now, I would like to start by acknowledging that our campus here at Royal Roads is located on the traditional lands of the Kusapsan and Lekwungen ancestors and families. And it is with deep gratitude that we live, work, and learn on these lands. Haishka Siem. So thank you again for joining us tonight. We are coming to you from the Center for Dialogue on the Royal Roads campus. And please feel free to chat with each other online, and please type your questions for Lucy in the chat. So let's get started. Now, you might know that the original plan for this series of events was quite different. Originally, in celebration of our 25th anniversary, we were going to hold these events locally, and in person. But of course, the pandemic had other plans. However, we certainly do not hesitate to take on challenges here at Royal Roads, including changing the way we deliver a speaker series. And our speaker series is all about challenges. Challenges like climate change, racial justice, inequality, and technological change. How do we even begin to tackle these challenges? And that is what we want to focus on here at Royal Roads. Here at Royal Roads, we seek to inspire people with the courage to transform the world. And the world is certainly transforming. Especially over the last 2 years, many more of us are learning and working and connecting online in ways we may not have before. And connecting through a screen might involve encountering artificial intelligence, known also, of course, as AI. The first person to answer your chat question when you need tech support is likely not a person at all. And if you're using your face to unlock your phone, that technology is AI. How about that handy email tool that predicts what you might like to put in your reply? There's AI. Now, views on artificial intelligence vary widely from those who see it as an invaluable tool to transform our daily lives to those who view it as a dehumanizing force that will take over our daily lives. And tonight's guest looks beyond that debate to show us the capabilities but also the very real limits of artificial intelligence. And I know she's going to challenge us to ask some different questions about what it means to society and to human and machine development. So I am so pleased to introduce tonight, at a safe social distance, Dr. Lucy Suchman. Dr. Suchman is the author of Human-Machine Reconfigurations. She spent 20 years at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and among her many honors, she has received the Lifetime Research Award from the Association of Computing Machinery, Special Interest Group on Computer-Human Interaction. Lucy Suchman is also Professor Emerita of the Anthropology of Science and Technology at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. And her current research looks at human-computer interaction and how artificial intelligence is applied to the domain of contemporary militarism around the globe. So I'm so honored to introduce you tonight, Lucy Suchman.
Thank you so much, President Steenkamp, for that lovely introduction. And it is so nice to be here with you in the same room. And I'm also deeply honored to be part of this series, considering the extraordinary people who I'm following. So thank you for that. So in my talk for you this evening, I hope to set the stage for a conversation around the figure of artificial intelligence, or AI. And I'm calling this a figure to emphasize that more than a specific technology or even a set of technologies, AI has become what anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss first named a floating signifier. That is, it's a term that suggests a concrete reference, but works to float or even to evade definition in order to maximize its suggestive power. In the case of AI, as it's increasingly cited in media and policy discussions, there's always an implication that someone else, somewhere, knows exactly what it is that we're talking about. In that case, we need to defer to the experts and to assume that any uncertainties we have reflect our own lack of knowledge. Unfortunately, many of those responsible for promoting and funding large projects in AI encourage this. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that AI is just smoke and mirrors, though there is no lack of that. Artificial intelligence as a field of computing has existed since the mid-1950s and involves a body of technologies and techniques of increasingly sophisticated, statistically based data analysis. I'm going to dig more deeply into those technologies in a moment, focusing on the dominant application area of computer vision, and I'll return to the image that you saw in my first slide then. But first, a brief word on my own engagement with AI, which began just over 40 years ago here at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, where I worked from 1980 to 2000, becoming a principal scientist and manager of a research group. I came to PARC as a PhD student in anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, one of those who was caught by the call in American anthropology at the time to study up, that is, to direct our research at powerful institutions. So seeking to follow that call, I ended up, through a series of circumstances, doing my doctoral research at PARC, which developed into a critical engagement with research in AI and cognitive science. And I came to the field with a very strong interactionist understanding of human action and communication, oriented to our ongoing co-construction of the sense and the significance of the worlds that we inhabit. Crucially, we're not just responsive to those worlds, we're always involved in variously reproducing or transforming them. And I've been interested across these decades in tracking the extent to which AI systems require closed worlds in which to operate as a significant difference between artificial and human intelligence. And I think you'll see the evidence of what I mean by that in the remainder of my remarks, but I'd also be glad to elaborate in the discussion on this idea of closed and open worlds. So, as just one of a myriad of examples of the kind of pronouncements about AI that currently dominate public discussion, we have this report from the 2020 Davos World Economic Forum on remarks by Google Alphabet CEO Sundar Pichai. Pichai made headlines with his assertion that, quote, AI is one of the most profound things we're working on as humanity. It's more profound than fire or electricity, end quote. Now, having made this claim, Pichai then went on to express his concern about the potential risks of AI, a concern that's generally taken as a mark of ethical responsibility. He also, and I appreciate this, called for a move towards some form of international agreement on governance in place of a reliance on tech companies to adjudicate the appropriate use of their systems. But I want to propose that, whether intentionally or not, statements of the risks of AI that are framed in terms of its enormous powers primarily actually serve the interests of those who are AI's promoters. By reiterating how very significant it is, statements of risk reinforce the idea that AI is some kind of autonomously evolving and inevitable thing, and that is, in my view, inherently irresponsible. It's irresponsible in the sense that it obscures the vested interests that underwrite big algorithmic systems, the ongoing investments required for their development, and the importance of questioning the inbuilt assumptions that inform these technologies and that define their limits. Studies of the history of technology make clear that there is nothing inevitable about technology developments. It's human interests and political will that keep technological projects going. That's why, after all, Pichai is at Davos. So Pichai's promise is among the most recent in a now long history of prognostications about AI. And here are some indicative examples from leading names in the field. So in 1965, founding father of AI, Herbert Simon, asserts that, quote, machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work that a man can do. Co-founder and professor of computer science at MIT, Marvin Minsky, assures us that in 1967, that, quote, within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. 50 years later, in 2017, futurist and director of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil, promises that, quote, by 2029, computers will have human-level intelligence. And then 1 year later, Tesla CEO Elon Musk worries that, quote, robots will be able to do everything better than us. I'm not sure exactly what to do about this. This is really the scariest problem to me. With this statement, Musk, who is, among other things, the purveyor of the holy grail of the driverless car, positions himself as a kind of helpless observer of the inevitable progress of robotics and is sounding a responsible alarm. But again, in my view, the idea that we should worry because AI and robotics are so powerful mystifies the technologies and obscures what I think we really should be concerned about. So to set out those concerns, I want to spend the remainder of my time exploring the limits and the politics of these technologies. And to get a sense of the limits, let's look more closely at the case of computer vision, starting with this blog post by computer scientist Andrej Karpathy, who is the senior director of AI at Tesla. So what would it take, Karpathy asks, for a computer to understand this image as you or I do? He challenges us to think explicitly of the knowledge that informs our seeing when we look at this image and that makes the image sensible to us. So here's an initial list. So you recognize it as a group of people together in a place that looks like a locker room. You recognize Barack Obama from the profile of his head, and it helps that he's in a suit. He's surrounded by other people in suits. This also suggests that they don't really belong in this place, but they're just visiting, though from the photo alone, it's hard to know why or where exactly. You recognize that there's a person standing on a scale, even though the scale is white and kind of blends in with the background. You've likely used the person's pose and knowledge of how people interact with objects to figure that out. You recognize that Obama has his foot positioned just slightly on top of the scale. That means that you've projected a 3D structure to the scene, not just the position of the leg and the 2D coordinate system of the image. You know enough of how physics works to assume that Obama's foot applies a force to the scales. Since the scale measures the force that's applied to it, it will over-represent the weight of the person standing on it. The person measuring his weight is likely not aware of Obama doing this. You derive this from his position, the fact that you know he can't see directly behind him, and that he's not very likely to sense this very sort of slight push of Obama's foot. You understand that people are self-conscious about their weight. You also understand that the weight shown will probably be higher than what he expects. In other words, you think about the implications of the events that are about to unfold seconds after this photo was taken and what the people in the photo might think and feel. You see that both Obama and the people watching appear to find the situation funny. So Obama is joking around. And finally, the fact that the perpetrator here is the US president at the time makes this more amusing than it would be if we didn't know any of these people. We understand what actions are more or less likely to be undertaken by different people based on their status and their identity, and that this is a bit outside the norm. So as Karpathy observes, we could go on indefinitely, but the point here is that you've read off a huge amount of information from the scene in the moments that you look at this picture and you smile. And as author Melanie Mitchell observes in her wonderful book, Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans, she says, when you look at this picture at the most basic level, you're seeing bits of ink on a page or pixels on a screen. Somehow your eyes and brain are able to take in this raw information and within a few seconds transform it into a detailed story involving living things. Objects, relationships, places, emotions, motivations, past and future actions. We look, we see, we understand. Moreover, we also know what to ignore. So there are many aspects of the photo that aren't relevant to the story, and things like the pattern on the floor, the reflections in the mirrors, and so forth. And we know to ignore all of those things. So Mitchell then proceeds to take us through the state of the art in computer vision, starting with the primary data set used by researchers, which is a vast database of millions of labeled images pulled from the web named ImageNet. So here's the simplest case. We have some images from the ImageNet sorted into the two categories of dog and cat. Now, after years of competition in computer vision, the title for accuracy in what's called image recognition, that is the correct matching of images with labels, is held by a program called AlexNet, which is named after Alex Krzyzewski, who was then a graduate student at the University of Toronto working with Geoffrey Hinton. AlexNet has an accuracy of matching images to labels of 85%. But we should pause here to note how the ImageNet images used as training data were labeled. The initial solution to this laborious problem when the database was created in 2010 was something called Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is effectively a web-based piecework job market where thousands of people can make very tiny amounts of income by hand labeling images. This is still a primary source for data labeling, but more recently we've seen the emergence of huge data factories, like this one in Zhejiang, China, where workers sit at workstations labeling images for training data. So it's human labor, in other words, that does the image recognition on which these computer vision systems are trained. So what does the training really mean? It turns out that computer vision systems don't actually see images at all. Instead, what are images for us are registered by algorithms as arrays of variously shaded pixels, each assigned a numerical value. That then enables the mathematically based detection of statistical correlations across images through increasingly sophisticated systems made possible by vast computational power. Those results can be iteratively adjusted until they match the association of images and labels in the training set. But it's becoming increasingly clear that in spite of the computational power, these so-called machine learning-based computer vision systems are extremely brittle. So this figure shows a series of original and what are called adversarial examples offered to the AlexNet program system. So the left image in each pair shows the original image, which was correctly identified by the system. That is, the system correctly associated the array of pixels in that image with the label that had been assigned to it by Turk workers. The right image in each pair shows the adversarial example derived from the image. So here, in order to test the system, researchers have deliberately made very small changes to the pixels. So while the new image appears to us humans to be identical to the original, the system misrecognizes the image. In this case, the pixel changes in each adversarial example result in the image being confidently classified by AlexNet as an ostrich. And here's another example of images created algorithmically as so-called adversarial test cases for AlexNet. So in each case here, AlexNet, which was trained on that ImageNet training set, assigned a confidence greater than 99% that the random noise that we see in these images was an instance of the category shown. And things get further complicated when the label describes not only singular objects, but scenes. So here's an example of an adversarial manipulation of an automatic image captioning system. So at the left are the original image, And the computer-generated caption, we might have some things to say about that caption, but we'll leave that for now. And at the right is the modified image, which to humans looks identical to the original, along with the resulting caption. So the original image, again, was intentionally modified by researchers to result in a caption containing the words dog, cat, and frisbee. So to sum up what I've covered so far, here's a working definition that I think of AI that I think is helpful. So AI is a cover term for a range of technologies of data processing and techniques of automated data analysis based on the iterative adjustment of relevant parameters according to a combination of internally and externally generated feedback. So the definition is not meant to understate the extraordinary scale and complexity of the systems that now exist. But these all are still elaborations of pattern discrimination that are based not on significance or learning in the human sense, but on computationally detectable correlations that, however meaningless, selectively produce results that are legible to humans. In other words, from the training data to the assessment of the results, it's humans who inform the input, and it's humans who find significance in the output of an algorithmic system's operations. So a second crucial step in appreciating AI's limits is to expand our understandings of what actually constitutes an AI system. We got a hint of that with the Amazon Mechanical Turk and the data factories in China. As a really nice, concise illustration, and I encourage you to look this up online where you can expand this exploded diagram. This is a project called Anatomy of an AI System, in which Kate Crawford and Vladimir Joler create this kind of exploded diagram of the device named Alexa. So they start from a single interaction with Alexa that's featured in Amazon's promotional video, the command, Alexa, turn on the hall lights. And as they write in the long essay that goes along with the diagram, quote, in this fleeting moment of interaction, a vast matrix of capacities is invoked. Interlaced chains of resource extraction, human labor, and algorithmic processing across networks of mining, logistics, distribution, prediction, and optimization. The scale of this system is almost beyond human imagining. How can we begin to see it, to grasp its immensity and complexity as a connected form? And it's that which this exploded diagram and the essay that goes with it works to do in a kind of excursion that takes us from the lithium reserves of Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina to the toxic waste dumps of Asia across radically unequal distributions of labor and reward. They observe that a child working in the cobalt mines of the Congo would need to work for 700,000 years nonstop to earn the equivalent of a single day of income for Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. And as they point out, each object in the extended network of an AI system, from network routers to batteries to microphones, is built using elements that required billions of years to be produced. At the same time, cycles of built-in obsolescence fuel the purchase of more devices and further unsustainable extraction and disposal. So with these understandings in mind, let's turn to the use of algorithmic systems in the targeting of persons. In 2021, the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab, in collaboration with the U of T International Human Rights Program, released an extensive report titled To Surveil and Predict. And the report analyzes algorithmic policing in cities across Canada. As the report explains, predictive policing is reliant on historical data, and for that reason, it runs the serious risk of reinforcing historical forms of discrimination. So they write, while algorithmic policing technologies may seem futuristic, they are inseparable from the past. Such technologies' algorithms are generally trained on historical police data, and such data has embedded within it historical and ongoing patterns of systemic discrimination and colonialism in Canada's criminal justice system. As a citizen of the United States, my own work has been focused on initiatives by the US military to incorporate computer vision systems algorithms into its operations with the aim of automating systems designed to identify threats. I've written about this in the journal Critical Security Studies on Security in an article titled Algorithmic Warfare and the Reinvention of Accuracy. And the basic argument is that claims for the accuracy and the precision of contemporary weapon systems, most famously remote unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, those claims conflate the accuracy with which a weapon, once it's fired, hits its target, and the much more fundamental question of the accuracy of the intelligence that identifies who or what counts as an imminent threat, and on those grounds as a legitimate target in the first place. So this image is a frame from a full motion video taken by a drone positioned over an area being surveilled by the US military. The image accompanied an article in The Guardian in 2018 titled The Kill Chain Inside the Unit That Tracks Targets for US Drone Wars, which describes the distributed system of drone operators, intelligence analysts, and associated military personnel who look for persons deemed to be threats to the United States. So this image is a drone's eye view of a desert area in Yemen, one of the locations named by the US military as an area of active hostilities. So the box that you see indicates an object, a building in this case, which has been identified as a prospective target. In 2017, the US Department of Defense announced plans for its flagship AI project, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, codenamed Project Maven and branded with this somewhat astonishing logo. The memo from the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Work, asserted the urgent need to, quote, turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD in the form of full motion video into actionable intelligence and insights at speed. The plan, as Work set it out, includes an initial project focused on the task of labeling data within the full motion video images generated by the US drone surveillance operations as a first step toward establishing the algorithms and the computational infrastructure needed to automate the identification of human targets. The media reports surrounding Project Maven overwhelmingly beg the question of the criteria by which objects are identified as imminent threats. So we're told that there were 38 categories that were used by the people who hand-labeled the first 150,000 images that made up the initial training data set, including the object, an ISIS pickup truck. This project demands that we turn our attention to the highly problematic systems of classification by which categories like Islamic State militants operating in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other areas of strategic interest are constituted. Even more urgently, it calls on us to question the premise that those categories are somehow pre-existing and are stable. We've seen that object labeling for computer vision starts with familiar objects, so cats and dogs are the canonical example. Animal taxonomies are some of the oldest systems of classification that we have, and these are domestic animals with which we're very familiar. So these are two very stable categories. We can sort creatures in a set of images into one or the other of these two categories without having to specify exactly what it is that we're using as the basis for that recognition. Now try mapping that onto categories like combatants and non-combatants, or terrorists and non-terrorists. These are fundamentally different kinds of categories. The uncertainties, the questions around how someone gets placed into one or another of these categories are profound, and the consequences are literally matters of life and death. So promoters will argue that, well, we just need to put more money in, and eventually we'll be able to stabilize the categories of combatants and non-combatants, or who is a terrorist. But I don't think it works that way. In fact, there are good arguments that it's simply unfeasible, if not unethical, immoral, and illegal to try to automate the process of making those kinds of categorical identifications. We can get a sense of the problem in this visual rendering of so-called precision airstrikes carried out by the US and coalition military in Pakistan from 2004 through 2015. So this visualization graphs 3,341 fatalities from all of the known drone attacks during that period. So you see the frequency of strikes shown above the midline, and then the count of persons killed below. So we can start by noting this enormous surge in strikes beginning with Obama's presidency in 2009. Then if we read the coded band across the top of the image, moving from left to right, we travel from this small patch of bright red, which is the 190 or 5.7% of victims who were positively identified as children, which means they were outside the bounds of legal killing. Then this somewhat larger band of crimson, which is the 534 or 16% of those killed identified as civilians. And then to the right of those, so now we have almost 25% of the deaths which are attributed to the status of so-called collateral damage, is the almost indiscernible white portion of the band, indicating the 52 people or 1.6% of those killed who were positively identified as so-called high profile or high value targets. And then finally, we're left with the remainder, the literal gray zone of 2,565 people, or 76.7% of those who were killed, categorized simply as other. So this calls into question statements like this one by Obama's assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, John Brennan, in 2012, when he stated, "With the unprecedented ability of remotely piloted aircraft to precisely target a military objective while minimizing collateral damage, one could argue that never before has there been a weapon that allows us to distinguish more effectively between al-Qaeda terrorists and innocent civilians." And again, the argument that there is this weapon which is allowing us to make these distinctions is profoundly problematic. This claim has now been definitively challenged in an extraordinary series of articles in the New York Times by investigative journalist Azmat Khan. She writes, "Over the past 3 years, I obtained more than 1,300 credibility assessments from the U.S. Department of Defense through the Freedom of Information Act. The reports covered allegations surrounding airstrikes that took place between September 2014 and January 2018. What I saw after studying them was not a series of tragic errors, but a pattern of impunity, of a failure to detect civilians, to investigate on the ground, to identify causes and lessons learned, to discipline anyone or find wrongdoing that would prevent these recurrent problems from happening again. It was a system that seemed to function almost by design to not only mask the true toll of American airstrikes, but also legitimize their expanded use. The documents reveal how unreliable the information that justified the strikes often was. So white bags that were taken to be ammonium nitrate at a homemade explosive factory were most likely bags of cotton at a cotton gin. A supposed ISIS headquarters was the longtime home of 2 brothers with their wives and children. An adult male associated with ISIS turned out to be an elderly female. A man with a weapon on his left shoulder had no weapon. Males on 5 motorcycles driving quickly and in formation, displaying the signature of an imminent attack, were just guys on motorbikes. A heavy object being dragged into a building was in fact a child. And along with the records, Khan's reporting is based on 5 years of on-the-ground investigations. She concludes, "On the ground, I found a pattern of life that was very different from the one that the military describes in its credibility assessments, and documented death rates that vastly exceeded U.S. Central Command's own numbers. I also came away with a grim understanding of how America's new high-tech air war looks to civilians who live beneath it, people in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan trying to raise families, earn a living, and stay away from the fighting as best they can." Astonishingly, to me at least, even findings like this can be spun by AI proponents as grounds for more funding. So in a public plenary in February of last year, Robert Work, you might remember him from Project Maven, offers this demonstration of moral reasoning. He says, "The biggest contributor to inadvertent engagements is target misidentification. Humans make mistakes all the time in battle. And the hypothesis is, to be proven, that artificial intelligence will improve target identification, which should improve and reduce the number of collateral damage damages reduce the number of fratricides. So it is a moral imperative to at least pursue this hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis enacts a familiar leap of faith. Failures of existing human-based systems become the justification for the further automation of those same systems. So the proposition here is that AI will somehow transcend the limits of the very knowledge systems that inform its design. This is an act of magical thinking, since we have ample evidence that the automation of data analytics works instead to reproduce and amplify the biases of the classificatory schemes that inform the training data. And nowhere is this more treacherous than when the data set is made up of various kinds of proxy signals, profiles, and so-called patterns of life, and the actions that follow are deadly. Analyses like Kahn's of the use of remotely controlled weapon systems should make clear that what the further problems would be in untethering these systems from their human controllers, which military technophiles take as the kind of next logical step in the automation of warfare. This is a process that I've been involved in working to interrupt, along with colleagues in a campaign led by Human Rights Watch, focused to date on the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW, a body charged with establishing prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. Following a report by the UN Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council, Christoph Heinz, in 2013, member states agreed to begin discussion on what were named lethal autonomous weapon systems, that is, systems in which the critical functions of target identification and the initiation of attack has been put under fully automated machine control. As a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which was part of this NGO coalition, I presented testimony at the CCW in April of 2016 on a panel on the question of machine autonomy. In my brief contribution, I argued that the discriminations that are presupposed by the principle of distinction in international humanitarian law, that is, identifying someone as a combatant or more widely as an imminent threat or as a person out of combat, that those distinctions can't be specified algorithmically. Because rules of engagement and the laws of war, like any kind of normative prescript, presuppose capacities of situational awareness that they do not and cannot fully specify, it's impossible to design an autonomous weapon system that could adhere to the laws of war. And I'd be glad to say more about that in our discussion. So for now, let me close with some recommendations for further readings. These are just 4 books among a growing number now that help us to connect AI to the longer history of automation, of which technologies of data analytics at scale, which is the current dominant form of AI, are the latest development. Automation as such is not inherently good or bad, but it's always located within specific political and economic relations involving labor, power, and historically unequal distributions of benefit and cost. AI, in sum, is not a singular or autonomous technology. Rather, it's a development in the history of automation that relies, like those that have come before, upon extractivism and devalued human labor, along with new requirements for the concentration of resources. Technologies of artificial intelligence tend to reproduce and amplify the historical injustices and unexamined assumptions that inform their data inputs and their applications. And there's nothing inevitable about them. Thank you.
Well, Lucy, thank you for an astonishing presentation. I was actually blown away by it. And I had a whole series of pre-prepared questions, but you answered most of them. So I'm gonna take a slightly different cut at things.
Okay.
What intrigued me, sort of listening to you through all of this, is an assumption I've had, and I think many people have, that AI will just get better and better and better, and you'll get to this perfect point. I think we've all been aware of how clunky things used to be and how much better they are now.
Yes.
So there's just the assumption and the belief that you'll get to that moment of perfection, whether it's whether it's visual recognition or it's autonomous weapon systems. And I wonder if you could just comment a little bit about, and I know you did through your presentation, but if you could comment a little more about why you don't think that is possible and why we actually believe that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And so let's talk about what's gotten better, right? Yeah. And this goes back a bit to that difference between closed and open worlds that I mentioned in the beginning. So in a way, what we've had is more and more and faster. Right. And by that I mean that the changes that have happened since around 2010, so let's say over the last 10 years, that we experience. We experience it when we're searching, we experience it in speech recognition. Those are due to the availability of enormous amounts of data because of the ways in which, through the World Wide Web, through our smartphones, we are constantly producing more and more available data for these increasingly computationally powerful systems to use. And along with that goes increasingly sophisticated techniques for doing those kinds of very, very fast, very complex statistical analysis of correlations in the data. The reason that that's able to happen is also closely related to the concentration of power in the so-called big five tech companies. The small number of actors who have the computational power to actually amass the data, store the data, and run these systems over them. And most of the researchers, university researchers who are really advancing so-called machine learning or deep learning are working through the big tech corporations because that's where the resources to do that are. So we're getting within a very particular kind of domain, we are getting more and more powerful systems. But those systems operate within these closed worlds of textual analysis, of translations of speech into computationally processable signals and so forth. The place where things really haven't made any progress, as far as I'm concerned, or very little, are where systems actually have to interact with a kind of open world. So we could think about autonomous cars, right? That autonomous vehicles has been the big promise. It's turned out to be harder than anticipated, although I would have anticipated it would be very hard because these are automated robotic systems that have to operate in the everyday worlds of urban environments, cities and so forth. And so it's, I think, increasingly clear, if you think about the big successes, say, in robotics, they've been, the assembly line to start with, where you can create a world that is engineered to be just what the technology needs in order to work effectively. With autonomous vehicles, I think they will only succeed to the extent that we start to redesign our highway systems, our urban environments, to make them safe for autonomous vehicles to operate in. So, and that's where the tension is. So in order to be effective, these systems require worlds that are set up in ways that they are able to deal with. And that's a very powerful, but a very specifically limited kind of domain of applications. And that's where I think we need to recognize those limits. And the fact that things get better and better within the limits of those closed worlds doesn't mean that they are also going to get better in the open worlds that we live in, that we communicate in, that we interact with every day. So,
well, thank you for that. And I was going to ask you about closed and open worlds. So I think that was a wonderful example. If you think about autonomous cars in particular, and we've all been waiting, we all thought it was coming, and then it was coming, and then was.
Yeah.
Maybe I could turn to ask you a little bit more about the New York Times articles.
Yeah.
I've been reading those with a developing sense of kind of horror, actually, at what has been going on there. And to quote you, you say it is impossible to design an autonomous weapon system that could adhere to the laws of war. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about that and the work you've been doing with the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and particularly what we could do. Like, what should we be doing given these kind of challenges?
Right, right. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I should mention maybe to start that while my work, I am a U.S. citizen, I feel some culpability for that, but I'm now here in Canada, and I should say that Canada now has plans for the acquisition of armed drones over the next 5 years or so. So this is not, a problem that doesn't touch us here as well. So this goes back to, it does go back again to this, when I talked about the categories, and the stability of those categories. So we are in a situation now of so-called irregular warfighting. Right? I mean, there is now a turn back to superpower conflict, but we'll leave that for the moment. But over the last 20 years, the military has been preoccupied with what have been characterized as irregular wars of counterinsurgency, of conflicts around terror and counterterror. These are situations of incredible complexity on the ground. So you have relationships that are, my uncle's son may be affiliated with an ISIS-related organization according to the systems of category that the U.S. And allied militaries are operating under. That person comes to my house for a meal. I then become marked as an affiliate. And so these mappings of very complex relationships on the ground to these very simple categories capture, even in the best case, they capture people who should not be captured. And increasingly, we're seeing that when you are fighting, when you are doing remotely operated basically extrajudicial assassination using armed drones, you're operating in urban areas, you're operating in areas, people living in large compounds with families. We just had an incident in Syria, very similar, where there was a so-called high-value target, but his whole compound was destroyed with a lot of children. And so we cannot reliably do the identification of these people who, and their killing is only legitimate if they pose an imminent threat. And so how does that get assessed? So we can't do that with the kind of precision that's claimed. And I think what that requires is a call. I mean, really my work is allied with those who are working for demilitarization, for a shift away from more and more investment in sophisticated weapon systems, which is of course an enormous industry as we know, towards investments in new innovative forms of diplomacy, of statecraft, and of basically letting go of a lot of the kinds of really hegemonic strategic claims over the world that the U.S.-led coalition is making. So it's an enormous social project on the order of social movements for anti-racist, decolonizing movements, climate change, and these things are all so closely related as well, historically and in their present operations.
I mean, one of the disturbing things about autonomous weapon systems is, as you said, they were presented as a better alternative, and strikingly, they really took off during the Obama presidency as well, which I think is interesting to think about.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a form of magical thinking.
Yeah. I do know that we can take some questions from the audience as well. So please do type your questions in if you have any, and I'll get to those in a moment as well. I wanted to ask you, really, you pointed out in your talk that AI is not as much about a singular technology that will suddenly change the world as it's a development in automation. And you probably have touched on the answer to this, but is there a point, or were there points where we might have intervened to determine what shape that development takes? Or are we so far along that the time has passed us?
Yeah, no, I don't think the time has passed at all. There are enormous vested interests at this point. We've seen the extraordinary growth in inequality, the kind of polarization of wealth, where the so-called big five corporations, so Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, have basically amassed just enormous amounts of resource, and also insinuated themselves into our lives in ways that make it hard to kind of extricate ourselves. But we don't have to have the kind of big data analytics that all of these investments are pushing us towards. There are growing movements on the part of tech workers themselves, and on the part of people interested in regulatory possibilities, in antitrust and breaking up big companies. There's exciting things are happening in the Federal Trade Commission in the United States at the moment. And so I think there are a lot of ways to push back on this, both on an individual level and on a social movement level. And I think if we think about this not as some kind of magical new technology, but as this incredible growth and concentration of data and data analytics, then we can push back on that, and we can really think about where we need that, and we can definitely push back on developments. The Citizen Lab report that I cited calls for bans on facial recognition technologies used in policing, bans on predictive policing. There's a lot of work being done around credit rating systems that are based on sociodemographics that just, again, reproduce longstanding forms of segregation. So this is, I think, a growing social movement in a number of areas. And I think one of the most important things is to recognize that there's nothing autonomous or inevitable about this. It's us. It's up to us to.
Yeah. Well, that's encouraging. That's really encouraging to hear. There was news today, of course, of Meta, which is the holding company for Facebook, losing $230 billion because of privacy measures Apple has introduced.
Yes.
So it's quite wild to kind of think about these things right now. I think it's probably time to take some questions, and I do have some questions from the audience and also some from social media. I will take a question we got from social media here. And this is a question: are corporate expectations for AI failing? And a related specific question: what does the recent disassembly and sell-off of IBM's Watson AI healthcare portfolio mean for the future of AI?
Well, I don't know about the Watson portfolio sell-off specifically, but and you mentioned the Meta stock price fall. I think because so many of these systems, the promises have been so oversold. So there's the fact that investors are attracted to the future prospects that are put forward. And when those things fail to materialize, then I think there is a certain built into the system. There's a certain then withdrawal of that kind of funding support, and some of those projects then will sort of collapse under their own weight. So there is a way in which these false promises that in healthcare, which is a place where when everything from robot caregivers to various kinds of apps that will, and not to say that there are certainly some health-related apps that are extremely valuable, but again, the shift of our attention away from investing in, one thing I think we should resist is the premise that there's a kind of truism that there aren't enough human caregivers, especially with our aging demographics, of which I count myself part. So we're in a labor crisis. There aren't enough caregivers. Therefore, we need AI and robotics. I think the premise that there aren't enough human caregivers really needs to be examined. Is it that there really aren't enough people, or is it that the investments haven't been made to ensure that that is work that is well rewarded, that is well recognized for the enormous value that it brings? So again, there it's a matter of political and economic interests and will. And so I'm always resistant to the idea that we have to automate because we must replace or make up for a lack of human labor. I would be very skeptical of those claims.
I'm going to take a question from the audience. Rick asks, why do you think proponents of AI say the singularity is inevitable in a relatively short amount of time? I'm not quite sure what that question means, but I hope you do.
So the singularity, which is an idea that's been around for a long time. It's most famously associated with Ray Kurzweil, who is a Google longstanding inventor and technologist who is now at Google. And so the idea of the singularity is that it's this sort of moment, this kind of tipping point where machine intelligence overcomes our own. So we've created machines that are more intelligent, more powerful than we are. And for technophiles, this is an incredibly attractive, if somewhat disconcerting prospect. And then they will proceed to become worried about what those machines then, will we become our pets? Will we become their slaves? So I think there is a kind of in science and technology studies, we talk about imaginaries, which is the idea that imagination isn't just an individual thing; it's a collective thing. And there's a very powerful kind of technological imaginary, people for whom this idea of machines whose power, who are modeled on a certain version of the human, and whose power becomes so great that we then become subservient to them. It is tremendously compelling. For me, it's not compelling at all for a whole number of reasons, but not least that that prospect is so unrealistic. It so fails to ignore exactly the kind of limits that I was talking about of the domains in which these technologies really are very powerful, and the domains that they haven't even begun to be able to operate in of sort of everyday life as we know it. So it is a very compelling thing for a lot of people, but we're no nearer to that than we were the first time it was proclaimed as an imminent development.
I know we're nearly at time, but I've just perhaps assembling a few comments I've seen from people getting questions in and some thoughts I've had too. Almost everybody you cited there, almost everybody has been male, right? And I wonder, you had an anthropology background. You went to Palo Alto in 1980, I
That's
believe.
right.
What was it like to be a woman in that environment? And do you think there's a kind of feminist critique of all of this?
There is indeed. I mean, absolutely. This is, and it's a very masculinist kind of imaginary, if we go back to that word, of a kind of dream. It's also, I would say, very much tied to a kind of imperialist, white supremacist colonizing. It's the same sort of impetus that leads to hierarchical orderings, that imagines a kind of relations of power that involve mastery and control on one hand, and service on the other, which are highly gendered, historically, ways of imagining and desiring relations to be. Some have argued that artificial intelligence is a kind of project in male reproduction. The kind of creating a machine in the image of yourself, which then becomes so powerful that you become subservient to it. There are extensive feminist critiques of those ways of thinking about the world, the failure to question those kind of unequal relations of power, to recognize the invisible labor, the invisible kind of reproductive labor that keeps the world going, and to think much more collectively, much more relationally. Again, I think in the same way that indigenous knowledges are the absolute sort of leading place to which we need to look in thinking about what happens after colonialism and how we can continue dismantling the kind of colonial extractivist histories that we're part of. I think those join with feminist critiques in imagining the kinds of other worlds and the kinds of other relations that are possible, and just recognizing the profoundly relational nature of our individuality, of us as so-called autonomous individuals. So,
well, Lucy, that was a really positive note to end on, and I want to thank you. The only mistake we made this evening was not scheduling another hour to continue this discussion, because it has been fascinating. So I really want to thank you for joining us tonight and for giving us so much to think about. And I want to thank our sponsor, the Victoria Times Colonist newspaper, and also, of course, thank all the staff who helped coordinate this wonderful event. It takes a lot of work, and I do want to acknowledge them. We will have another Changemakers Speaker Series event in April, so watch the website, rruchangemakers.ca, or follow us on our social media channels for details. And again, thank you to everyone out there. Thank you to all of you for watching along with us tonight. And we hope to see you next time. And good night. Thanks, Lucy.
thank you.
Thanks.